So to start off, maybe some of y'all previously thought, when you thought of fire and wildlife, of things article coming out of Colorado, or this article coming out of California, which depicts not a great image when we talk about wildlife and fire. Or perhaps you are more familiar with stories like this, where they talk about how fire is not necessarily a bad thing for wildlife and can even be beneficial. Hopefully these are all the things that we think about for the most part. So U.S. Fish and Wildlife puts out a lot of great articles about this dilemma about, is fire good or is it bad for wildlife? And this is an example of a pretty good one. So basically they're telling us that wildlife mortality during a fire event, whether that be a wildfire or some other kind of perhaps prescribed fire, is generally very small, and it doesn't really have a great impact on wildlife populations as a whole. And in fact, a lot of these species respond to fire in a good way. They're adapted to it. They developed in landscapes that regularly experience fire. And on top of that, a lot of these species benefit from fire, and it's actually an essential part of their habitat. So based on this, we can hopefully conclude that fire can be beneficial. But some people might still argue, well, there's some negative impacts, some animals die, so it's better for us to just never burn, right? Hopefully all of us here would greatly deny that and say, no, that's not true. And I've got a conglomeration of some research here that also indicates that this isn't necessarily true. So when we do suppress fires, we can see a lot of different effects on wildlife. We can see things such as dense canopy cover preventing the growth of forage plants for species such as white-tailed deer. We can see replacement of communities that are dependent upon fire habitat, and they end up being replaced with communities that perhaps inhabit more heavily wooded habitats. We can see winter forage quantity and quality suffer when we suppress fire. And we can see species such as aspens that are really dependent upon fire as part of their life cycle decline. And then we see subsequent declines in the wildlife species that feed on plants such as this. An example that's a little bit more closer to home for a lot of us is the greater prairie chicken. The range used to extend in this light purple area, give or take, from Texas all the way up to California, Canada. It is not California. But it is now reduced to approximately the dark purple area. There's some areas with this map, but for the most part, it's hopefully indicating just how much the range has shrunk. And a lot of this loss of this population of this species throughout its range has been attributed to woody encroachment and to agricultural conversion. And most of this woody encroachment has been attributed to fire suppression. So when we do suppress fires, we can see, extremely large impacts on an entire species across a lot of its range. And last but not least, as we see out of a lot of those stories from California or out in the West where they've done a lot of fire suppression, when you do that, it builds up the fuel load, and then we see increased severity of fires when they finally happen. And this can lead to increased direct mortality for some species, especially in the presence of high fences, which can make it a little bit more difficult for species to escape. But overall, this direct mortality is still small enough, even in these cases, that generally it has a negligible effect on wildlife populations. So based on this, no fire is obviously not beneficial to a lot of different species of wildlife. So let's talk about prescribed fire. How can we use that to benefit wildlife? What are some examples of what it can do for wildlife? So if we revisit prescribed fire, as you're going to hear a gajillion times during this conference, it's planned. It's used to meet some kind of management objective, and that management objective can include wildlife in some way, shape, or form. And it considers that public and staff safety and whether or not you're actually going to be able to achieve your management objective. And prescribed fire has been recorded to have both direct and indirect impacts on wildlife. Those direct impacts, again, are individual mortality, displacement, so some animals or wildlife species will leave an area after you've done a burn, and they may come back over time It really depends on the species. And we can see loss of nests, of cavities, of food, of cover. But keep in mind that all of these direct impacts have, again, a negligible effect on most wildlife populations. What really drives wildlife response to prescribed fire is those indirect impacts. And all of those indirect impacts, for the most part, are related to the restoration of fire-dependent habitat. So these species respond to changes in the habitat that are induced by prescribed fire. And that can include removal or suppression of invasive species. It can open the overstory and promote the growth of those understory forage and browse plants. It can enhance diversity of species, and not just of plants, we can see enhanced diversity of wildlife as well. And it can even fix nitrogen in the soil, leading to a fertilization effect, and positively impact soil moisture filtration. So there's a lot of different ways that prescribed fire can impact the habitat, which can then lead to beneficial impacts on wildlife as well. So let's talk about some case studies. I've gathered some various research for a handful of species that indicate how prescribed fire can benefit these species. So grassland birds, this is what I study. So I could wax poetic about this, but I'll keep it short and brief. Grassland birds are one of the fastest declining groups of animals within North America. And this has been attributed to a variety of reasons, including changes in our natural grazing regimes and also fire suppression. And some researchers are interested in looking at how patch burning can be used to restore grassland bird habitat, because this can mimic those natural fire grazing patterns that we have lost. So this particular research group did do some patch burning, and they looked at the response of grassland birds in a couple of different ways. And they found that patch burning can increase species diversity. So species that weren't found in that area before were coming back to the area once they did patch burning. For example, the Henslow's sparrow, which is the one on the bottom left here, returned once they did patch burning in certain areas. They also saw that dickcissel nest success increased, and they even saw that nest success of birds nesting along roadsides increased. So patch burning affected not only one species, but it infected a handful of species in quite a few different ways. Now, moving on from grassland birds, let's move to something that's a little bit farther from home, the Florida panther. So we do not have large mammals like this throughout the Great Plains, depending upon the region that you're in. However, we used to, and it's a good idea to keep it in the back of your mind. And if you're in Texas, you might be in an area that cougars may be returning to at some point. So the Florida panther is an endangered subspecies. And they were doing some research on a particular refuge where they did some small prescribed burns for about 10 years in the 90s. And they had radio-collared 17 panthers that they were then tracking. And they discovered that the panthers appeared to use areas that had been burned within a year more often than they used other areas. And they were even more likely to have kittens in these areas. And they attributed this increased use of areas that had been recently burned to an increase in their prey population, deer. So something about the prescribed fire changed the habitat that led to an increase in deer, and that increase in deer then led to an increase in Florida panthers within this region. So what was going on with deer? Well, I found an example a bit closer to home for you Oklahomans from the Ouachita Mountains. Did I pronounce that right? Yes, okay, from the Ouachita Mountains. So they were attributing deer mortality in this area to mast failure and the lack of evergreen browse. So basically these animals were starving to death during the winter. And they decided that they wanted to do some timber harvesting and prescribed burning to create forest openings in hopes that this would benefit deer and increase the amount of food that they have available to them. And they found when they did this mix of management techniques that the standing forage crop was up to 25 times greater. And they also tried testing out a couple of different burn intervals. And they found that, at least in this particular area, longer burn intervals increased woody browse production. So this should indicate to us that the prescription used for one species is not the prescription that we should use for all species. Hopefully everyone is familiar with that, but keep that in the back of your mind that what benefits white-tailed deer in this particular region, that particular prescription might not be the prescription that you want to use for another species. And just as a side note, a lot of these other studies have also indicated that prescribed fire can increase forage crops. Moving on to wild turkey, I'm sure there's a lot of hunters here, so I threw in some game species to keep your attention. Turkey habitat, as I'm sure many of us are familiar with, is a mix of woodland and open clearings. And perhaps you decide that you want to do some prescribed fire to open up your woodlands and create some of those clearings. One of the questions that might come to your mind is, wait, one of those direct impacts was loss of nests. Is this something that I need to worry about? Well, research has shown that, at least in pine forests, very few nests are actually destroyed by prescribed fires. And the few that are have a negligible impact, again, on those wildlife populations. And they've even found that hens appeared to avoid areas that hadn't been burned within the past 2 years. In addition to that, it seems that they preferred to forage in areas that had been burned within the last 2 years. And they attributed this to an increase in plant diversity and insect diversity. So basically, they had more food in these areas than they did in places that hadn't been burned recently. So again, we see an example of prescribed fire inducing a change in the habitat, which then induced a change in turkey. A species that's, again, close to home for people in Oklahoma and Texas is the Blackcapped Vireo. They were very recently delisted just earlier this year in April or May, I believe. And they're found in areas that are rangeland with scattered shrubs and open grasslands. And a lot of this rangeland was in decline due to fire suppression, clearing of shrubs, overgrazing. And these declines, of course, led to the endangered species status for Blackcapped vireos. Well, there's been a lot of studies done on this, especially in Texas, and they found that probability of occurrence, so whether or not Blackcapped vireos are even going to be in an area, decreases the longer it's been since you did a prescribed burn. The best habitat develops about 3 to 5 years after a burn. And although that habitat can remain suitable for up to 20 to 30 years post-burn, keep in mind this probability of occurrence and even nesting success decreases as we get farther and farther from the burn. And last but not least, they also found that nesting mostly occurs in that early successional habitat that's developed after a burn as well. Now, last but not least, especially for many of us, is the northern bobwhite. Just a reminder again about their habitat. They're usually found in shrublands that have a mix of open woodlands, grasslands, bare ground, and say again you decide to do prescribed fire as some kind of treatment to create some of this habitat. One of your questions again might be, wait, what about nesting if we do a burn during the nesting season? Well, they found that those lightning season fires do have an insignificant effect on the population level. You might lose some nests, but overall it's not going to affect bobwhite. And you can time your fire to avoid peak nesting. And in addition to that, similar to turkey, we see preferential nesting in areas that were burned within the past 2 years. And once again, this is due to an increase in seed and insect abundances in these areas. And not to mention, when you do a prescribed burn, in some cases you can expose seeds that were previously under that organic litter layer. So overall, we see an increased food supply. So what I want you I hope everyone takes home from this is that, yes, you can use prescribed fire to manage and benefit wildlife in a lot of different ways. Your particular treatment that you do is going to change depending upon your specific wildlife objective. So really think about timing, think about intensity, think about all these other questions that you want to ask when you're developing a fire prescription. And think about, what dominant plants do you either want to remove or encourage? What structures do you want to remove or encourage? And once you have an idea of how you want to manage wildlife and how you want to manage habitat for that wildlife, work with your local managers, your local biologists and fire crews to develop a plan that's going to help you reach that goal.